Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for having me today and having me virtually on Zoom. So yeah, I'm here today to talk about big data in the humanities. And so my plan today is to give you just sort of a bit of an overview of what what data is in the humanities and what big data is in the humanities. It's been around for a while, but in a way it's still an emerging area in the humanities. So I'm trained as an art historian, and my PhD didn't include any training in data management or working with data. It was all very old school history. So it's a really exciting and emerging area, but as you'll see, it's like the amount of data that we can use in the humanities is constantly growing. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of some projects that we're doing in our Centre for Digital Humanities Research, just to sort of, frame the way that the very different and diverse ways that we work with data in the humanities. So this is something I start with for talks for broad audiences, but also kind of quite specific humanities audiences, because a lot of the time when I talk to people in the humanities about data, their first response is, oh, I haven't really got any data. Like, what data would I use? How would I use data? We're used to looking at art and reading books and using physical archives, doing physical excavations out in the field for fields like archaeology. We're not used to thinking about the research materials that we use as data. And Miriam Posner, a US academic, is really very clear on this, and I recommend following up her work. But she's sort of just making this point that in the humanities, we often think of data as sort of spreadsheets of information and numbers. And we don't realize that the things that we work on, the art, the words, the texts, can also be conceived as data. And so, yeah, a little secret that everything is data. And so all of these things that are the focus of our research in the humanities, and this is, just a small sample of what is an enormous field of research. They're sort of biased examples that link to the work I do. But things like maps, paintings, art, archival records, inventories, handwritten inventories, texts, they're all data. And the thing is that they exist, we can think of them as data in their physical form in the world, but a lot of the time when we talk about data in the humanities now, what we mean is these objects in a sort of digitized form. So digital texts, digital images that are made of things like maps and art, and then also the transcription of archival records and inventories into things that are more readily recognizable as data, into things like spreadsheets and CSV files. And so a lot of this work, there's a lot of work in just creating the data in the humanities. So some people have resources that they can quickly access, and others, I'm one of these researchers, a lot of the time still have to work with a physical archive. And so part of the work that I have to do is often also that process of actually turning it into digital data that I can use computational methods with. And also, what is big? I've really enjoyed the previous talks because I think it shows the range of different ways that we think about what is big data. And I know I sit on committees at the university about data, and it's always the astronomers who kind of win the conversation about who's actually got the biggest data sets in terms of storage. But in the humanities, we sort of end up thinking about it in a range of different ways, and it tends to depend on the area that you work in. And so for some researchers, they're looking at huge corpuses of digitized books, so a million books, millions of books. For others, they're looking at it's maybe just a number of texts, but they're looking at it at a word level. And so what is a couple of books that you can probably pick up and carry around, once you break it down in its components of single words and you're analyzing them, then that also becomes big data. Working with social media, things like Twitter is something that we do a lot in our center. And that rapidly, you know, a corpus from that can rapidly expand from 1,000 to 10,000 to tens of thousands. And one of the things, a professor who is based at Oxford, who we've done a bit of work with, Professor Dave DeRoe, he's a computer scientist who works with musicology. He often says if it's too big, like if the data is too big for you to hold in your head, if you need a computational process to deal with that data, then it is in some way big data. And so, and in the humanities, especially where the infrastructure for dealing with the data is less sophisticated often, you know, just getting access to, you know, even a basic level supercomputer is a real challenge. And so big data can mean things that you can't process on your own laptop, essentially. But the other thing that the other point I always really like to make is that humanities data is it's not just an issue of whether it's big or small, it's also that it's extremely complex. And so it might be structured data. You know, we have things in spreadsheets and relational databases, linked data, things in graph databases, but a lot of it's unstructured. A lot of it's being created by institutions and researchers, and they're all creating their own standards as they go. If they're all doing their own, I'm not sure that you can call them standards, but they're all creating perhaps their own metadata standards. This is an area I try and encourage more collaboration around, but it's also often messy, it's incomplete. So an example that we often use with the students is if you're looking at a range of dates that you might have got out of a catalogue or an archive, you might have granular details. So you could have time, day, month, year, but you could also have things that just say circa 1518. And that can break a computational process because the computer doesn't know what to do with circa as a concept. But we also shouldn't correct it, because then we're changing the historical record. If we take the circa out, we're implying that we know that it was 1518 when in fact we don't. And so all of these things make working with the humanities data a challenge. It's fun. It's kind of the reason that we're interested in it, because of these gaps. And this messiness really characterizes, I think, the work of the humanities, but it also makes it really challenging. A lot of computational processes that we use come out of STEM, I guess, a lot of the time, and a lot of the work that we do in our center is thinking about how we can take those processes and rework them to work with the type of research questions that we ask in the humanities. And so is humanities data big? I think perhaps not as big as some areas, but it is big. So things like Trove, which is the National Library of Australia's portal, was launched just over 10 years ago, and it now aggregates 6.5 billion items. I couldn't find a sort of petabyte measure. I'm not sure how much space it takes up, but it's a lot. Europeana, which is similarly a portal based out of Europe for cultural and scientific collections, has over 10 million artifacts. The Met Museum in New York has 400,000 high resolution open access images. And Google Arts and Culture now has 2,000 partners who have anywhere from a couple of hundred items to thousands of items. So yeah, so the cultural industries are producing huge amounts of digital resources that are aimed at the public, but are a huge resource for researchers to also use, especially in years like this when none of us can do our usual field work or travel. But we also use sort of big data. We also engage with it in terms of looking at what else is kind of out there that we can either turn a kind of critical humanities eye on, asking about how, things like social media, how we engage with them in our sort of human interactions in our communities. So there's a lot of work getting data sets out of Twitter, Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter, if I can sort of call it that. Reddit, these sort of forums to analyze social trends. Government data, so a lot of government data is open now, which is brilliant, and we work with that as well. Also things like huge text repositories, and so the Hattie Trust is a repository. They, as part of the legal deal around Google Books digitizing books, the Hattie Trust got a copy of every digitized text, and so there's now, I haven't got the numbers to hand, but there's now sort of millions, perhaps even getting into billions of texts that can be mined for subjects, for topics, for a variety of information. And that image is just a visualization of the different languages represented in the Hattie Trust. So the big orange one, blob in the middle, is obviously English, and then the others sort of going down, the larger ones are mostly European languages, which is sort of just an interesting observation in itself. So some of the things that we're doing in the centre are looking at ways to work with these data sets. Is a project that I lead is looking at creating spatial databases. So rather than just databases where you go in and put in your keywords and look for resources, we're trying to organise resources about the landscape in Italy. It's focused on Italy at the moment. To take historical resources about the environment, the ecology, also the archaeology, and the sort of social history, and to create a database that can be accessed via a map, so that it will bring together researchers from different disciplines, history, environmental history, art history, and allow them to sort of share resources and collaborate around a place. So this idea of kind of spatial humanities. We've got researchers work. This is a project led by one of our PhD students who's looking at how you can study mourning online. So she's done this investigation comparing responses to celebrity deaths online, and so comparing Twitter and Weibo. And again, she's dealing with these sort of large data sets that she's downloading, and she varies from looking at them as a big corpus and looking at trends, and then also pulling out individual tweets and looking at them on an individual level. So there's a whole range of ways that you engage with this. But another thing that we do a lot of in the centre, and I think is a big part of the attraction of working with these digital methods and data sets in the humanities, is to think about public engagement. And so this is a project actually from one of our courses that we run out of the centre. This was an engineering and computer science student who's built a memory game about the Snowy Hydro scheme and so he was using data sets that he accessed from the National Museum of Australia, the National Archives of Australia, but then putting them together in a game that's actually aimed at school children to encourage them to learn about the history of infrastructure in Australia. So some of so there's really exciting, there's a lot of data that we can use in the humanities. There's a range of data that is both big and small, but still difficult. And there's an increasing number of projects that are working in this area, but there's still quite a lot of barriers to engagement. And so these are things like copyright, over things, especially things like art and media collections are often very hard to access because of copyright. Digital literacy is a huge barrier. We're still not teaching, we are in the centre, but generally we're not teaching students in the humanities enough about digital literacy. Closed access, diverse standards, so materials that we create as researchers in the university, often we do it in a very different way to, say, our colleagues at cultural institutions. And so the barriers, often people are dealing with sets of data that aren't digitized yet. So there's an imbalance between the data that exists in ready for computational methods and that doesn't. Software expenses often aren't resourced very well in the humanities. It's often not hasn't traditionally been a focus of investment. People don't know what's easy and what's hard. They don't know if something will take 10 minutes or 10 days or 10 years. And yeah, the translation of methods is a challenge. Often people expect that they're going to find the perfect data set, which you know, anyone working in big data knows that perfect data sets don't really exist. And yeah, these kind of conversations are hard because we're having to talk across disciplines, talk to computer science, and a lot of people aren't really sure how to approach those conversations. So this is a kind of sample of a lot of the comments that we tend to get at the center. So, you know, how long will this take? Can I do it for free? I haven't got funding. I haven't got anyone with technical expertise. And so some of the, I can see I'm kind of coming up to 15 minutes, so I'll wrap up. Some of the ways that we address this is, one of them is communication. So our center aims to actually to be a place where we can build and guide these conversations. So our staff are from areas, art history, that's me, web science, computer science and engineering, museum and heritage studies, anthropology. And so part of it is we're trying to sort of set a model for how you actually build those collaborative groups across, you know, really across disciplines, not just from history to musicology, but from art history to computer science. And also digital literacy and training. And so a project that we've developed this year, methodology, is aimed at helping people to upskill themselves. And so to take on new approaches for working with data, especially under COVID, because a lot of people have had to pivot their research focus. And it's very frustrating, but it's also an opportunity to look at what might exist in terms of computational data that you can use in place of being able to go to the archive or collection or community that you normally work with. So thanks. I'll stop sharing my screen so that I can hear you again.